The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Lady Charlotte Windsor, the newly appointed Princess of Cambridge, stood before the towering windows of her private chambers. At 28 years old, she had spent the last decade preparing for this moment, yet nothing could have prepared her for the weight of the crown that now rested upon her shoulders. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, bustled about the room, preparing the elaborate ceremonial gown that Charlotte would wear for the official portrait sitting. This was no ordinary portrait. It would hang in the Great Hall alongside generations of royals who had come before her. A permanent record of her place in history, Your Highness. The royal guard has arrived to escort you to the portrait chamber, Margaret announced softly, her hands smoothing the intricate embroidery on the crimson velvet gown. Charlotte turned from the window, her expression troubled. She had heard whispers in the corridors, rumors that made her stomach twist with anxiety. The new portrait tradition, established by the Queen's Council just months before, required subjects to be painted in the ancient ceremonial robes of their ancestors. These robes, preserved for centuries, said to carry the spirit and dignity of the royal bloodline. But there was a problem. A significant problem that Charlotte had discovered only the night before. The ceremonial robes meant for her were those worn by Princess Catherine the Bold, a warrior princess from the 15th century who had led troops into battle. The robes were designed for function in combat, not modesty in portraiture. They consisted of leather armor pieces, chainmail segments, and fabric that would expose far more of Charlotte's form than she was comfortable with, especially knowing that the royal guard would be present throughout the entire sitting as protocol demanded. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Captain James Rothwell, the head of her personal guard, entered with a formal bow. He was a stern man in his late 30s, decorated with medals from his years of service to the crown. His reputation for unwavering adherence to protocol was legendary throughout the palace. Your Highness, we must proceed to the portrait chamber within the hour. The royal painter, Master Dupont, has arrived from France and is preparing his materials. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them before her. Captain Rothwell, I must speak with you about the ceremonial robes. The captain's expression remained neutral, though Charlotte noticed a slight tension in his jaw. The robes have been approved by the Queen's Council, Your Highness. They are authentic artifacts from the royal collection. I understand their historical significance, Charlotte said carefully, choosing her words with precision. However, I have concerns about the appropriateness of wearing such garments during the portrait sitting, particularly with the royal guard present in the chamber. Margaret had stopped her preparations and now stood frozen. Sensing the delicate nature of the conversation unfolding, Captain Rothwell cleared his throat. Your Highness, protocol requires that the royal guard remain present during all official ceremonies. This includes portrait sittings for the royal collection. It is a matter of security and tradition that dates back 300 years. Charlotte felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Captain, the robes in question are warriors' garments. They were designed for battle, not for a formal portrait sitting. Princess Catherine wore them with full armor beneath. Armor that was lost in the fire of 1734. What remains is, she paused, searching for the right words, insufficient for maintaining the dignity expected of a royal portrait. The captain's eyes flickered with something that might have been understanding, but his voice remained formal. I am aware of the nature of the garments, Your Highness. However, my orders come directly from the Lord Chamberlain. The tradition must be upheld, even if it means compromising my dignity. Charlotte's voice was quiet but firm. For the first time, Captain Rothwell's professional facade seemed to crack slightly. He glanced at Margaret, then back to Charlotte. Your Highness, I am a soldier. I follow orders, but I am also, he hesitated, I am also a man of honor. Perhaps we might discuss this matter with the Lord Chamberlain before proceeding. Charlotte felt a small surge of hope. Would you be willing to accompany me to speak with him? Of course, Your Highness. Though I must warn you, Lord Ashford is not known for his flexibility regarding tradition. They made their way through the palace corridors, their footsteps echoing off the ancient stone walls. Portraits of Charlotte's ancestors watched them pass, painted eyes seeming to judge her reluctance to follow in their footsteps. She wondered if any of them had faced similar dilemmas. If any had questioned the traditions that bound them. Lord Ashford's office was located in the oldest wing of the palace, a room filled with leather-bound books and the musty smell of centuries-old documents. The Lord Chamberlain himself was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Princess Charlotte," he said, rising from behind his massive oak desk. "Captain Rothwell, I assume this concerns the portrait sitting scheduled for this morning." Charlotte stepped forward, drawing on the poise that had been drilled into her since childhood. "Lord Ashford, I come to request a modification to the ceremonial requirements for my official portrait." The Lord Chamberlain's expression hardened. "The requirements have been established by tradition and approved by Her Majesty the Queen herself. I am not in a position to modify them." "The ceremonial robes are inappropriate," Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "They were designed for a different purpose, a different era. To wear them now, in a portrait that will hang for generations, would not honor the dignity of the crown." Lord Ashford leaned back in his chair, studying her with calculating eyes. "Princess Charlotte, your concern is noted. However, the robes represent your connection to Princess Catherine the Bold, one of our most celebrated ancestors. The people expect to see this lineage honored. The people would not expect to see their princess portrayed in a manner that lacks proper decorum," Charlotte countered. "Surely there must be an alternative that honors both tradition and dignity." The Lord Chamberlain was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "There is one possibility. In the royal archives, there exists a second set of ceremonial garments from Princess Catherine's era. They were designed for her coronation rather than for battle. However, they have never been photographed or documented for public records. Using them would require approval from the Royal Historical Society, a process that could take weeks." "Weeks?" Charlotte's heart sank. "The portrait sitting is scheduled for today." "Indeed it is. Which is why I suggest you proceed with the original plan. Master Dupont has traveled far to paint your portrait, and rescheduling would be... complicated." Charlotte looked at Captain Rothwell, whose expression remained carefully neutral. She realized with a sinking feeling that she was trapped between tradition and personal dignity. With no easy path forward, what if Captain Rothwell spoke suddenly, surprising both Charlotte and Lord Ashford? "What if we proceed with the original robes, but adjust the positioning of the royal guard? Perhaps we could position ourselves facing outward, toward the doors, fulfilling our security duties while allowing Her Highness some privacy during the preparation and sitting." Lord Ashford frowned. "That would be a departure from protocol." "Minor departure," Rothwell argued. "One that maintains the spirit of both tradition and dignity. The guards would still be present in the chamber, but our focus would be on potential threats from outside, not on the princess herself." Charlotte felt a surge of gratitude toward the captain. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. Lord Ashford drummed his fingers on his desk, considering. "I suppose such an arrangement would not technically violate the security requirements." "Very well, Captain Rothwell. You may position your guards as you suggest. But the portrait sitting must proceed today with the original ceremonial robes. Is that understood, Princess Charlotte?" Charlotte wanted to protest further, but she could see that this was the best compromise she was likely to receive. "I understand, Lord Ashford. Thank you for your consideration." As they left the Lord Chamberlain's office, Charlotte felt Captain Rothwell's presence beside her like a shield. "Thank you, Captain," she said quietly. "Your suggestion was unexpectedly helpful." "I serve at your Highness's pleasure," he replied formally. But there was something in his tone, a warmth that hadn't been there before. That made Charlotte feel slightly less alone in her predicament. They returned to her chambers. Where Margaret had laid out the ceremonial robes on the bed, Charlotte stared at them, her heart pounding. The leather was cracked with age, the chainmail segments dull with oxidation. The fabric portions were sheer in places, revealing far more than she was comfortable with. "Perhaps," Margaret suggested gently, "we could add some additional undergarments? Something that would provide more coverage without altering the appearance of the robes themselves." Charlotte's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant, Margaret. Do we have time?" "If we work quickly, Your Highness." For the next 30 minutes, they worked together, carefully constructing additional layers that could be worn beneath the ceremonial robes without being visible in the portrait. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than the alternative. The portrait chamber was a magnificent room located in the east wing of the palace, with vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of historical battles and royal celebrations. Tall windows let in streams of natural light, which Master Dupont had insisted was essential for capturing the true essence of his subject. The French painter had already set up his easel and arranged his paints with meticulous care by the time Charlotte arrived. "Ah, Princess Charlotte," he exclaimed, his accent thick and melodious. "I am honored to capture your beauty for posterity. Please come, let me see how the ceremonial robes appear in this light." Charlotte entered the chamber with Margaret close behind her, carrying a silk robe that covered the ceremonial garments underneath. Captain Rothwell and 4 other guards filed in after them, taking up positions near the doors as the captain had promised. True to his word, they faced outward, their backs to the room's interior. Master Dupont circled Charlotte like a hawk, studying its prey, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Magnifique," he murmured. "The robes are extraordinary. But tell me, Your Highness, why do you wear this covering? I must see the full effect before we begin." Charlotte's fingers tightened on the silk robe. "Master Dupont, I would prefer to reveal the ceremonial robes only when absolutely necessary. Perhaps you could first establish the background and positioning?" The painter stroked his pointed beard thoughtfully. "I suppose we could work in stages?" "Very well. Please position yourself on the platform there in profile. Yes, just like that. Hold your head high, shoulders back. You are a warrior princess, strong and brave like your ancestor." As Charlotte took her position, she became acutely aware of every sound in the chamber. The guards shifted occasionally at their posts. Margaret arranged the folds of the covering robe. Master Dupont hummed to himself as he mixed paints on his palette. The morning light shifted gradually across the marble floor, marking the passage of time. "Now," Master Dupont said after what felt like an eternity, "I must see the robes properly to capture the details. The light is perfect at this moment. We cannot delay." Charlotte's heart began to race. She looked toward the guards, but they remained facing the doors, unmoving. Margaret stepped forward to help remove the covering robe. Her hands gentle and reassuring, as the silk fell away, Charlotte stood in the ceremonial garments of Princess Catherine the Bold. Despite the additional undergarments Margaret had cleverly constructed, Charlotte still felt exposed in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. The leather pieces were positioned strategically, but left significant areas of her arms and shoulders bare. The chainmail segments caught the light but did little to provide coverage. The fabric, though layered now, was still thin and ancient. Master Dupont gasped with what Charlotte hoped was artistic appreciation rather than shock. "Extraordinary. The authenticity is remarkable. Your Highness, you embody the spirit of your ancestor perfectly." Charlotte forced herself to stand tall, to channel whatever strength Princess Catherine must have possessed to wear these garments into battle. But as Master Dupont began to paint, his eyes constantly moving between her and the canvas, Charlotte felt increasingly vulnerable. "Turn slightly to the left," the painter instructed. No, too much. Back to the right. Yes, perfect. Hold that position." The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. Charlotte's muscles began to ache from holding the pose. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the chamber's coolness. Through it all, the guards remained at their posts, and Captain Rothwell's broad shoulders never turned toward her. During a break, when Master Dupont stepped back to evaluate his work, Charlotte noticed something unexpected. Captain Rothwell's hand, which had been resting casually on his sword hilt, was clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. There was a tension in his posture that suggested he was struggling with something. Perhaps the very situation he had helped create. "Captain Rothwell," Charlotte called softly, "is everything all right?" The captain's shoulders stiffened. "Yes, Your Highness. Everything is secure." But Charlotte could hear the strain in his voice. She realized with sudden clarity that this situation was nearly as uncomfortable for him as it was for her. He was a man of honor, forced by duty to participate in something that clearly violated his sense of propriety, perhaps Charlotte suggested. Her voice gaining confidence, the guards could take a brief respite. Master Dupont and I can continue with Margaret present. Surely the security concerns can be addressed from outside the chamber. Master Dupont looked up from his canvas, frowning. I work better without interruptions or discussions of logistics, Your Highness. Please maintain your pose. Captain Rothwell finally turned, just his head, careful not to look directly at Charlotte. I cannot leave without violating direct orders, Your Highness. I apologize for any discomfort this causes. There was something in his voice, a note of genuine regret that touched Charlotte. She understood then that they were both prisoners of tradition, both bound by expectations and rules that sometimes conflicted with basic human dignity. I understand, Captain, she said quietly. Thank you for your honesty, as the portrait sitting continued. Charlotte found her mind wandering to the history of the robes she wore. Princess Catherine the Bold had worn them not for art or ceremony, but for survival. She had led her troops against invaders, defending her kingdom with courage and strategic brilliance. She had worn these garments as armor, as protection, as a symbol of her refusal to be confined by the expectations of her gender or station. What would Catherine think of this moment? Would she understand Charlotte's discomfort, or would she view it as weakness? Would she approve of tradition being honored in this way? Or would she argue that times change and traditions must adapt? Your Highness, Margaret whispered during another break, you're doing wonderfully. Just a bit longer. But as the afternoon wore on, Charlotte's discomfort grew. Not just physical discomfort from the pose and the garments, but a deeper unease about what this portrait would represent. Future generations would see her in these robes and think they understood something about her character. Her strength, her connection to history, but would they know the full story? Would they know about this day? It's about the compromises and the discomfort and the struggle to maintain dignity while honoring tradition. Master Dupont finally stepped back from his easel with a satisfied smile. The first sitting is complete. You have been an excellent subject, Your Highness. We will need at least 3 more sessions to complete the portrait, but the foundation is established. Charlotte felt her heart sink. 3 more sessions. 3 more days of standing in these garments, of feeling exposed and uncomfortable, of watching Captain Rothwell's rigid shoulders and knowing he was as trapped as she was. Master Dupont, she said carefully, is there any way to complete the portrait more quickly? Perhaps with longer sessions. The painter looked horrified. Rushed art is poor art, Your Highness. No, we must take the proper time. The light changes throughout the day, and I must capture you in the perfect moment. We shall meet again tomorrow at the same time? As Margaret helped Charlotte back into the covering robe, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. This was only the first sitting, and already she felt drained by the experience. Captain Rothwell approached, still carefully maintaining his respectful distance. Your Highness, if I may speak freely? Please do, Captain. I want you to know that I have issued strict orders to my guards regarding confidentiality. Nothing that occurs in these portrait sittings will be discussed outside this chamber. You have my word as an officer and a gentleman. Charlotte met his eyes, seeing in them a mixture of respect and something that looked like admiration. Thank you, Captain. That means more than you might realize. That evening, Charlotte sat in her private chambers with Margaret, too tired to eat the elaborate dinner that had been prepared. Instead, she sipped tea and stared out at the palace gardens, thinking about the days ahead. Margaret, she said quietly, do you think I'm being foolish? Perhaps I should simply accept the situation and stop fighting against it. Margaret set down her own teacup with a firm clink. Your Highness, there is nothing foolish about wanting to maintain your dignity. Princess Catherine was brave in battle, yes. But I imagine she also fought many smaller battles for respect and recognition. You are her worthy successor in that regard. Charlotte smiled weakly. I hope you're right, though I'm not sure how much more of this I can endure. You will endure because you must, Margaret said firmly, and because you have allies in this fight, even if they cannot always show it openly. Charlotte thought of Captain Rothwell's clenched fist, his careful words, his arrangement of the guards. Margaret was right. She wasn't completely alone in this struggle. But as she prepared for bed that night, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that the next 3 portrait sittings would test her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The physical discomfort was one thing, but the emotional toll of being on display, of feeling vulnerable while maintaining a facade of royal composure, was something else entirely. She dreamed that night of Princess Catherine the Bold, dressed in full armor, riding into battle with a sword held high. But in the dream, Catherine turned to look at Charlotte, and her expression was not fierce or proud. Instead, it was understanding, almost sympathetic, as if she knew exactly what Charlotte was going through and wished she could help. The second portrait sitting began much like the first, but Charlotte approached it with a different mindset. She had spent the night researching Princess Catherine the Bold, reading every account she could find in the palace archives. What she discovered had changed her perspective entirely. Princess Catherine hadn't just been a warrior. She had also been a reformer who challenged the customs of her time, who fought not only foreign enemies, but also the constraints placed upon women of her era. She had worn those battle robes by choice as a statement of defiance and capability. She had made people uncomfortable on purpose, forcing them to reconsider their assumptions about what a princess could and should be. Understanding this, Charlotte realized something crucial. Her discomfort with the portrait sitting wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of courage. The courage to recognize when tradition had outlived its purpose, when ceremony had become more about control than honor. As she took her position on the platform, with Master Dupont arranging his paints and the guards taking their places at the doors, Charlotte made a decision. She would complete this portrait, but she would also find a way to change the tradition that had created this situation. "Your Highness seems more confident today," Master Dupont observed, beginning to sketch the outline of her pose. "The inner strength shows in your eyes." Excellent. What the painter interpreted as confidence was actually determination. Charlotte had spent the morning before the sitting composing a letter to the Royal Historical Society, requesting a formal review of ceremonial requirements for royal portraits. She had also spoken quietly with several younger members of the royal household, gauging their opinions on tradition versus modernization. The response had been surprising. Many of them, it turned out, harbored their own doubts about certain protocols and ceremonies. They simply hadn't felt empowered to voice them. Charlotte's willingness to question the portrait tradition had opened a door to broader conversations about which customs truly served the monarchy and which merely perpetuated outdated practices. "Captain Rothwell," Charlotte said during a break in the sitting, "I would like to ask your opinion on something." The captain turned slightly, still maintaining his careful distance. "Of course, Your Highness. In your years of service, have you ever questioned an order that seemed wrong, even if it was technically proper?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Yes, Your Highness. More than once." "And what did you do?" "I followed the order," he said simply. "But I also filed a formal report expressing my concerns and suggesting alternatives. Some of those suggestions were eventually implemented. Change in an institution as old as the crown moves slowly, but it does move." Charlotte nodded, appreciating his honesty. That seems like a wise approach. Balance duty with advocacy for improvement. It's the best we can do, Your Highness, when we're caught between tradition and conscience. Master Dupont cleared his throat impatiently. "Your Highness, the light is shifting. We must continue." As Charlotte resumed her pose, she noticed something different in the chamber's atmosphere. Captain Rothwell's shoulders seemed less rigid. Margaret moved about the room with quiet confidence rather than nervous energy. Even the other guards seemed more relaxed at their posts. It was as if acknowledging the awkwardness of the situation had somehow diffused its power. By speaking openly about the conflict between duty and dignity, they had all found a way to exist more comfortably within it. The second sitting passed more quickly than the first. Master Dupont worked with focused intensity. Charlotte found that channeling Princess Catherine's defiant spirit made it easier to maintain the uncomfortable pose. She wasn't just enduring the sitting anymore. She was using it as a catalyst for change. When the session ended, Charlotte did something unexpected. She asked Captain Rothwell and his guards to remain behind while Margaret helped her change back into her regular attire. Once she was properly dressed, she returned to the portrait chamber where the guards waited, curious and slightly apprehensive. "Gentlemen," Charlotte began, "I want to thank you for your professionalism during these portrait sittings. I know this has been an awkward situation for all of us. Captain Rothwell's solution of positioning you to face outward has helped, but I'm aware that this doesn't completely address the underlying problem." The guards exchanged glances but remained silent, waiting to hear what she would say next. "I want you to know that I've initiated a formal review of the ceremonial requirements for royal portraits. I'm not trying to disrespect tradition or dismiss the importance of security protocols, but I believe we can honor both history and dignity. I believe we can maintain your ability to protect me while also ensuring that ceremonial requirements don't create unnecessarily compromising situations." One of the younger guards, a man Charlotte recognized as Lieutenant Hayes, spoke up hesitantly. "Your Highness, if I may say so, many of us have felt uncomfortable with certain aspects of the traditional protocols. We've simply never felt it was our place to voice such concerns. It's everyone's place to voice concerns when something seems wrong," Charlotte replied firmly. "Regardless of rank or position, the crown serves the people, and that includes those who serve the crown. Your comfort and dignity matter too." Captain Rothwell stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Your Highness, speaking for myself and my men, we appreciate your consideration. It takes courage to challenge tradition, especially when you've only recently assumed your title." "Princess Catherine challenged tradition," Charlotte said with a slight smile. "I'm simply following in her footsteps, though perhaps in a different way than the portrait sitting suggests." Over the following days, as the third and fourth portrait sittings took place, Charlotte's campaign for reform began to gain momentum. She had strategically shared her concerns with sympathetic members of the royal household, who in turn spoke with others. The Royal Historical Society had acknowledged her letter and agreed to form a committee to review ceremonial protocols. Lord Ashford, the Lord Chamberlain, was not pleased. He summoned Charlotte to his office between the third and fourth sittings, his expression stern. "Princess Charlotte, I have heard that you are attempting to change long-established traditions regarding royal portraits and ceremonies. May I remind you that these traditions exist for important reasons and have been approved by generations of monarchs?" Charlotte met his gaze steadily. "Lord Ashford, with respect, the fact that something is traditional doesn't necessarily mean it's right or beneficial. Princess Catherine the Bold herself was a reformer who challenged the traditions of her time. I'm not trying to destroy our heritage. I'm trying to evolve it in ways that respect both history and human dignity." "The Queen herself approved these ceremonial requirements," Lord Ashford said, his tone warning, "and perhaps it's time someone explained to Her Majesty the full implications of those requirements." Charlotte replied calmly, "I don't believe she would knowingly approve of protocols that compromise the dignity of royal women." "Do you?" Lord Ashford's expression flickered, revealing uncertainty for the first time. "That is a complicated question, Your Highness. It's actually quite simple," Charlotte said. "Would you want your daughter subjected to what I've experienced during these portrait sittings? Would you consider it an honor or a humiliation?" The Lord Chamberlain was silent for a long moment. Finally, he sighed deeply. "You make a valid point, Your Highness. Perhaps the committee review is warranted after all, though I make no promises about the outcome." Charlotte smiled. "That's all I ask, Lord Ashford. A fair review and an honest conversation about whether our traditions truly serve us or whether we've simply become slaves to them." The fourth and final portrait sitting had a different energy entirely. Word had spread through the palace about Charlotte's reform efforts, and she had received dozens of letters of support from members of the royal household, historical scholars, and even a few older royals who admitted they had harbored similar concerns but had never felt empowered to voice them. "Master?" DuPont noticed the change in Charlotte's demeanor immediately. "Your Highness, you radiate power today. This is exactly what I needed to capture the final details of your portrait. You embody Princess Catherine's strength perfectly." As Charlotte stood in the ceremonial robes for the last time, she felt truly connected to her ancestor for the first time. Princess Catherine had worn these garments as an act of courage and defiance. Charlotte was honoring that legacy not by simply replicating Catherine's choices, but by showing the same courage and defiance in her own way. For her own time, Captain Rothwell and his guards maintained their respectful positions. But there was a new quality to their presence. It felt less like surveillance and more like solidarity. They were all part of something larger now, a movement toward thoughtful evolution of royal traditions. When Master Dupont finally declared the portrait complete, Charlotte asked to see it before it was unveiled publicly. The painter agreed, and Margaret, Captain Rothwell, and a few other trusted members of the household gathered to view the finished work. The portrait was stunning. Master Dupont had captured Charlotte in the ceremonial robes, but he had also captured something else in her expression: determination, intelligence, and a quiet strength that had nothing to do with the armor she wore. She looked like a woman who knew her own mind and had the courage to act on her convictions. "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered, tears in her eyes. "It tells a story," Captain Rothwell observed. "Not just about the past, but about the present and future as well." Charlotte studied the portrait for a long time, seeing not just herself, but also the journey she had undertaken during those 4 sittings. She had entered this experience feeling vulnerable and uncertain. She was leaving it with a clear sense of purpose and the beginning of real change. "Master Dupont," she said finally, "you've created something truly remarkable. Thank you for your patience and your artistry." The painter bowed deeply. "It has been my honor, Your Highness. You are a worthy subject in every sense of the word." 3 months after the completion of the portrait, Charlotte stood in the Great Hall, surrounded by hundreds of guests assembled for the official unveiling ceremony. The portrait hung behind a crimson velvet curtain, waiting to be revealed to the public for the first time. This was typically a routine ceremony, a formal acknowledgement of another royal portrait joining the collection. But Charlotte knew that today would be different. The Royal Historical Society had completed its review of ceremonial protocols, and their findings had been both surprising and vindicating. After examining historical records and interviewing current members of the royal household, the committee had concluded that many traditional requirements had evolved over time in ways that diverged from their original purposes. The ceremonial robes, for instance, had never been intended for portrait sittings at all. That tradition had been invented only 50 years ago by an overzealous historian who had misinterpreted an ancient text. More significantly, the committee had discovered that several previous princesses had privately expressed similar concerns to Charlotte's, but had felt powerless to challenge the established practices. One princess from the 1920s had even refused her portrait sitting entirely, claiming illness. Though her private diaries revealed the true reason for her reluctance, armed with this information, Charlotte had worked with the Royal Historical Society to draft new guidelines for royal portraits and other ceremonial occasions. The guidelines maintained respect for tradition while also ensuring that all protocols upheld the dignity of those participating. They included provisions for consulting with subjects about ceremonial requirements, offering alternatives when appropriate, and regularly reviewing practices to ensure they remained relevant and respectful. The Queen herself had reviewed and approved the new guidelines, adding a personal note in which she thanked Charlotte for having the courage to address issues that had troubled her predecessors but that no one had felt empowered to resolve now. As Charlotte prepared to unveil the portrait that had sparked this transformation, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in what she had accomplished, certainly, but also a deeper understanding of the responsibility that came with her position. She had the power to effect change, but that power came with the obligation to use it wisely and in service of others. Lord Ashford approached the podium, his expression considerably warmer than it had been during their tense conversation months earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to unveil the official portrait of Princess Charlotte Windsor of Cambridge. This portrait, painted by the renowned Master Dupont, shows Her Highness in the ceremonial robes of Princess Catherine the Bold, honoring the connection between past and present in our royal lineage." He paused, glancing at Charlotte with what might have been the hint of a smile, But this portrait represents more than just artistic achievement or historical continuity. It also represents the beginning of an important evolution in how we approach royal traditions. Thanks to Princess Charlotte's initiative, we have undertaken a comprehensive review of our ceremonial practices, resulting in new guidelines that honor both our heritage and the dignity of all who serve the crown. There was a murmur of interest from the assembled guests. This was clearly not the standard unveiling ceremony speech. Charlotte stepped forward to address the gathering. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was steady. "Thank you, Lord Ashford. When I first learned that I would be sitting for this portrait, I approached it with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The ceremonial robes of Princess Catherine the Bold are remarkable historical artifacts, and I was honored to wear them. However, I also found myself uncomfortable with certain aspects of the traditional portrait sitting protocol. She saw several older royals shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while younger members of the household leaned forward with interest, rather than simply enduring that discomfort in silence. As others before me apparently did, I chose to question whether the tradition as it existed truly served its intended purpose. Was it honoring history, or had it become a rigid ritual that had lost connection to its original meaning? Charlotte's eyes found Captain Rothwell in the crowd, standing with his guards in their dress uniforms. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. What I discovered through this process was that Princess Catherine, the Bold herself, was someone who questioned traditions when they became oppressive or meaningless. She challenged the assumption that women couldn't lead armies or make strategic decisions. She wore armor not because tradition demanded it, but because tactical necessity and personal choice led her to do so. She was, in the truest sense, a reformer. Charlotte moved toward the covered portrait. In that spirit of thoughtful reform, I worked with the Royal Historical Society to develop new guidelines for ceremonial occasions. These guidelines were approved by Her Majesty the Queen and will help ensure that future royals can honor tradition without sacrificing dignity. She grasped the cord that would release the velvet curtain. The portrait you're about to see shows me wearing Princess Catherine's ceremonial robes, but I hope it also shows something more. I hope it shows a woman who, like her ancestor, had the courage to stand for what she believed was right, even when doing so was uncomfortable or unpopular. With a smooth motion, Charlotte pulled the cord. The crimson velvet fell away, revealing Master Dupont's masterpiece. The crowd gasped collectively. The portrait was magnificent. Master Dupont had captured Charlotte in a powerful three-quarter pose, the ceremonial robes catching the light dramatically. But it was Charlotte's expression that truly captivated viewers. Her eyes met the observer's gaze directly, unwavering and intelligent. There was strength in her posture, but also a subtle defiance, a sense that she was aware of being watched and judged, and was meeting that scrutiny on her own terms. Around the edges of the portrait, almost as a frame within the frame, Master Dupont had painted faint images of other women from history, scholars, warriors, reformers, as if to suggest that Charlotte's story was part of a larger narrative of women who had challenged expectations and changed their worlds. The applause began slowly and swelled. People rose from their seats, moved by both the artistry and what the portrait represented. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and examined the portrait more closely, Charlotte found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Several older royals approached her privately too, share their own stories of uncomfortable traditions they had endured in silence. "You've done something important, my dear," one elderly duchess told her quietly. "You've shown us that respecting tradition doesn't mean being enslaved by it. I wish I'd had your courage when I was your age." Captain Rothwell approached as the crowd began to thin. "Your Highness, may I offer my congratulations? Not just on the portrait, but on everything you've accomplished." "I couldn't have done it without your support, Captain," Charlotte replied warmly. "Your suggestion about positioning the guards made those sittings bearable, but more than that, your willingness to acknowledge the awkwardness of the situation validated my concerns. Sometimes we need someone to confirm that our discomfort is justified before we can find the courage to address it. I merely did my duty, Your Highness. You did more than that. You showed me that even within rigid hierarchies and traditional structures, There's room for empathy and creative problem-solving. That's a valuable lesson. Over the following weeks, the impact of Charlotte's actions rippled outward in unexpected ways. The new ceremonial guidelines were adopted not just for royal portraits but for various other traditional occasions. Several other outdated protocols were quietly revised after being examined through the lens of whether they truly served their intended purpose or simply perpetuated old practices without clear benefit. More significantly, Charlotte's willingness to voice concerns and advocate for change had created a new culture of openness within the palace. Junior staff members felt more comfortable raising questions about procedures. Long-standing assumptions were examined rather than simply accepted. The palace, an institution often seen as frozen in amber, began to show signs of thoughtful evolution. Margaret, who had been by Charlotte's side throughout the entire ordeal, reflected on the changes during a quiet evening in the princess's chambers. "You know, Your Highness, when this all began, I was terrified that you would face severe consequences for questioning tradition. I worried that you would be labeled as difficult or disrespectful." "I had the same fears," Charlotte admitted, "but I realized that the real disrespect would have been allowing a problematic tradition to continue, unchallenged simply because I was afraid of making waves." Princess Catherine didn't make waves because she enjoyed conflict. She made waves because she saw injustice and had the courage to address it. "Do you think she would be proud of you?" Margaret asked. Charlotte looked at the ceremonial robes, now carefully stored in a protective case in her chambers. The Royal Historical Society had requested to borrow them for a special exhibition about royal women and reform throughout history. The exhibition would tell the story not just of Princess Catherine the Bold, but also of Charlotte and others who had challenged traditions in service of progress. "I think," Charlotte said slowly, "that Princess Catherine would understand that courage takes different forms in different eras. Her courage was physical, riding into battle, making strategic decisions under pressure. My courage is different. It's the courage to question, to advocate for change, to use whatever power I have to make things better for those who come after me. That's a profound legacy to leave, Your Highness." Charlotte smiled. "The funny thing is, I never set out to create a legacy. I just wanted to get through a portrait sitting without feeling humiliated. But sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the largest changes." In the months that followed, Charlotte received letters from young women across the kingdom, thanking her for standing up for dignity and demonstrating that tradition and progress aren't mutually exclusive. Several universities invited her to speak about the balance between honoring history and embracing necessary change. A popular historian even wrote an article comparing Charlotte's reform efforts to those of Princess Catherine the Bold, suggesting that both women represented the best of what the monarchy could be. When it combined respect for tradition with willingness to evolve, the portrait itself became one of the most visited and discussed pieces in the royal collection. School groups studied it not just as an art piece, but as a historical document representing a turning point in how the monarchy approached tradition. Art critics praised Master Dupont's technical skill while also acknowledging that the portrait's significance transcended mere aesthetics. Captain Rothwell continued to serve as Charlotte's head of security, and their relationship evolved into one of mutual respect and trust. He became an advocate for revisiting other security protocols that might be updated to better serve both safety and dignity. Several of his suggestions were implemented, improving conditions not just for royals, but for the guards themselves. 1 year after the portrait's unveiling, Charlotte attended a ceremony at which Princess Catherine's ceremonial robes were placed on permanent display at the National Museum, accompanied by a comprehensive exhibition about royal women and reform. The exhibition included Charlotte's portrait and told the full story of how it came to be created and the changes it inspired. Standing before the display, Charlotte read the placard that explained the significance of the robes. Worn by Princess Catherine the Bold in the 15th century as symbols of her refusal to be constrained by gender expectations, and later worn by Princess Charlotte Windsor of Cambridge, in a portrait that sparked important reforms in royal ceremonial practices. These robes represent both the consistency and evolution of royal courage across centuries. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed at Charlotte. "Ma'am, that's the princess from the painting, the one who changed the rules." Charlotte smiled at the girl. "I didn't change the rules alone. Many people helped, including people who had been waiting for someone to start asking the right questions. Were you scared?" the girl asked boldly. "Yes," Charlotte admitted. "I was very scared. But I learned that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." The girl nodded solemnly. And Charlotte hoped that this young person, and others like her, would grow up in a world where questioning unjust traditions was seen not as rebellion, but as responsibility. That evening, Charlotte returned to her chambers and stood before her window. Looking out at the palace gardens where lights twinkled in the dusk, she thought about the journey that had begun with a simple portrait sitting. It had transformed into something much larger and more meaningful. The ceremonial robes of Princess Catherine the Bold would live on in museums and history books, symbols of one woman's courage in her time. But they would also be remembered as catalysts for change in a different era. Proof that history isn't static, but continues to unfold and evolve with each generation. Charlotte had entered that portrait chamber months ago, feeling vulnerable and uncertain, dreading the discomfort of the ceremonial requirements. She had emerged not just with a beautiful portrait, but with a deeper understanding of her own power and responsibility. She had learned that tradition deserves respect, but not blind obedience. That courage manifests differently across time and circumstance, and that sometimes the most important battles are the quiet ones fought not with swords, but with words, questions, and the willingness to stand up for what's right. The portrait hanging in the Great Hall would outlast her, would be studied and discussed by generations not yet born. Some would see it as a beautiful piece of art, others would see it as a historical document. But Charlotte hoped that a few, perhaps those who most needed the message, would see it as proof that one person, standing up for dignity and advocating for thoughtful change, really could make a difference. Princess Catherine the Bold had changed her world with a sword and tactical brilliance. Princess Charlotte Windsor of Cambridge had changed hers with courage of a different kind. The courage to question, to advocate, and to believe that tradition should serve people, not the other way around. In the end, perhaps that was the truest form of royal legacy, not the traditions we preserve, but the wisdom to know when and how those traditions should evolve.